Tonight we come to a lesson that could very well be titled, What's New About the New Testament? It is from the 25th chapter of the book that we're following, or roughly following, the Archaeology and Bible History book. And this has to do with the end of the intertestament period, the time when the period between the testaments stopped, and the beginning of the New Testament period. It introduces some of the things that we will find in the New Testament. We talked last we met, and obviously I don't expect you to remember all of this, but we talked about the Hasmonean dynasty for a period of time from about 165, well, not about, but from 165 BC to 63 BC, Israel had a short period, about 100 years, of independence. And this was due to the rebellion of an old man named Mattathias and his 5 sons, who had an ancestor called Hasmon, and they were called the Hasmoneans. And they ruled, various descendants of that family ruled during that time. During that time also, and this was following the wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids following the death of Alexander the Great. And those wars went on from Alexander's death until 165 BC. Remember, we learned that 165 BC was when they went in the temple and relit the lights after the Greeks had extinguished and defiled the temple. Now, during this time, and we've got history all happening kind of like in a salad bowl. There's all sorts of pieces in here we have to try to put together. But during this time, the Greeks were fading away and the Romans were ascending. During the time period between the end of the Hasmoneans, or the time of the Hasmoneans, and the coming of the Romans, the Roman empire, it wasn't an empire then, it was a republic, was changing over to becoming an empire. And I know this is not a definition we normally use, but historically, an empire, you have to have an emperor to have an empire. The kings have kingdoms, emperors have empires. That's the historical use of the word. Rome couldn't have an empire until they had an emperor. And the first emperor of Rome will be a man whose name was Gaius Octavius, but who took the name of Augustus because he didn't like, well, we'll talk about why he didn't like his name in a minute, but he didn't particularly like his name. Anyway, about 69 BC, or shortly before the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, the Romans had pretty much conquered the Greeks. The Romans were expanding their republic under 2 very talented and competing generals. One was named Pompey, the other was named Julius. Julius is the one that became the Caesar. And all this is about 69 BC. Julius was generally taking Egypt and the area to the south, and Pompey was coming around the top of the Mediterranean Sea, the northeast corner of the Mediterranean Sea, and coming down into what is today Syria. At this time, there were 2 brothers, the 2 surviving Hasmonean brothers. They were men named John Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. And they both came to Damascus. Now, on the back of this sheet, you see this is New Testament Palestine. This is what this map is. And let me tell you, save this map. We'll be appealing to it next week is our business meeting, but after that we meet again, we'll be appealing to this map as well. But Damascus up here in Syria was the place where Pompey had gotten to at this time. The 2 brothers, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, both realized that the Romans were going to occupy Jerusalem, or occupy Judea. So they both went to Pompey and appealed to him. Each one of them wanted Pompey to make them ruler when he took over the city. Pompey didn't make a commitment. He said, we'll deal with it when we get there. Well, Aristobulus, the brother, encouraged the country to revolt and resist the Romans. And while he was encouraging people to revolt, he also changed his mind and went to Pompey and promised that he would give him money if he would, that he could deliver the people, thinking Aristobulus apparently thought that he could change the people's mind at will, like most politicians do. Pompey then sent men to Jerusalem to collect the money Aristobulus had promised, and Aristobulus didn't pay the money. And that understandably made Pompey mad, and this is why Pompey besieged Jerusalem. This is why it was not his normal, the Romans' normal procedure to take a place by force if they didn't have to. In other words, if they came into a place and people would just give up, they would accept it. They didn't fight if they didn't have to fight. When you think about expanding empires, this is like we talked about Alexander the Great. You think about battle after battle after battle as they fight for town after town, but most of the towns would just surrender when faced with the overwhelming force of an invading army. And this is what probably would have happened in Jerusalem but for the intrigue of Aristobulus. So Pompey then comes against Jerusalem and actually comes into the city. He goes into the northeast corner of the city within the city walls and encamps in the wall next to the temple that's there. And he brings his siege machines then to the north side of the wall of the temple and begins to batter it down and destroys it. And this is what happens to the second temple that was rebuilt in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. And this took place in 63 BC. And in 63 BC, the Romans gained entry to Jerusalem, and what followed was a great, great slaughter of the Jews. The siege of Jerusalem took a 3-month period. Now, when Jerusalem was conquered, Aristobulus was put in prison, and John Hyrcanus was not made ruler. He was made high priest. And then Judea becomes a part of the Roman province of Syria. It's not independent. It's Syria now with no ruler. Now, as they say, if you've ever read the Western books, meanwhile back at the ranch. So we've got to kind of back up a little in our salad bowl and talk about some other people. While all this was going on in Israel, about 300 years before Christ, there were a group of people. We have no idea who they were. We don't know where they came from, and we don't know where they went. But they appeared on history, and the scene of history. They're called the Nabateans. The Nabateans are the people who displaced the Edomites from Edom or Idumea. Now, it's not on this map, but Edom would be south of here and to the east of the where the Jordan River would run, down in here. Edom was the descendants of Esau, the ever so great descendants of Esau, called the Edomites. Read about them all the way back in the book of Exodus. The Edomites who were displaced by the Nabateans, incidentally, the Nabateans built the rock cities that you see, Petra, the rock city, the big, looks like a temple, looks like a bank, in front of a bank, carved out of the stone. You may have seen that in movies. They use it a lot in movie sets. And there's nothing in it. I've been to it. I've been there. And it's beautiful on the outside, and it's maybe it's not as deep as for me to you inside. It's not a place where people live. There were places that they did, but that was just a temple of some kind. Anyway, the people who were displaced moved into the southern part of Judea and settled near the town of Hebron, south of Jerusalem here. That's where they settled. In 165 BC, Judas Maccabeus, who was the first Maccabee, incorporated these people into Israel. He declared them, just because he wanted to, I suppose, declared them all to be Jews, and had the men who wanted to be Jews were circumcised, and they were kind of adopted Jews. They weren't, of course. They were Edomites, descendants of Esau. At this point, one of the next Hasmoneans, Alexander Jannaeus, you may remember him from last week, appointed a man named Antipas, who was an Idumean, to be the governor of Idumea. Idumea is the Edomites. So Antipas becomes the governor of the Idumeans in 165 BC. Now this chart here on the other side, whichever side you're on, but the side that doesn't have the map, this chart is a genealogy of the Herodians, the Herods. And this is what we're getting to, is how Herod the Great became king when Jesus was born. In fact, the whole point of this is to get to this very interesting passage in Luke chapter 2. We read this in the Christmas story. Not many people ever look at the history behind it and how it got there. Look at the scripture, Luke 2, 1 through 4. It came to pass in those days, there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. This taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria. And all went to be taxed, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth into Judea, unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was the house and lineage of David. We've got Caesar Augustus, not mentioned in the Old Testament. We've got Cyrenius, who's governor of Syria, which isn't mentioned in the Old Testament. We've got a census, which is what this was. The King James Version translates that tax. It literally means counted. This was a census they were doing, and that's why they had to go to their own home. Obviously, if you're going to pay your taxes, you don't have to go to your ancestral home to be taxed, but if you want to be counted, you have to get somewhere where you can be still. And they gathered families together so they could count how many are in this family, how many in that family. And Joseph then goes up from Galilee, which isn't mentioned in the Old Testament, so we have to know where do these kind of things come from. Okay. Antipas, the father of Herod the Great, the grandfather of Herod the Great, rather, is appointed governor of Idumea, and this is the Edomites who live in the physical territory of Israel. They're not down in Edom anymore. They're in the south part of Israel. Think Palestinians who live in this territory once occupied by Israel. Anyway, he is appointed the governor by Alexander Janneus, who is a Hasmonean ruler. When he dies in 78 BC, and his son Antipater succeeds him. Now remember, this is all before 63 BC when the Romans get there. When the Romans get there, Pompey makes John Hyrcanus II the ruler of Judea. Antipater then becomes the ruler of Idumea. And here's where we get the next layer of our history salad. We talked about the Hasmoneans. We've now introduced the Herodians, and now we've got to talk some about the Romans, because remember I mentioned there were two Roman generals, both of them very skilled men. Pompey, who's fighting on the west, and Julius, who will wear the name Caesar, who's fighting on the east. They come into a great battle, a literal war. It's a civil war in Rome with the forces of Julius and the forces of Pompey. Both these men are very, very great men, and they fight each other. They turn on each other. And at the Battle of Pharsalus, Julius Caesar defeats Pompey and kills him. And with that, Julius Caesar becomes the head of all the Roman armies. And he assumes the title of Caesar. Caesar meaning supreme ruler or head man, something like that. It's interesting that from the time Julius Caesar assumes that, and all this takes place somewhere around 43 BC. By the time all of that takes place, from there until World War I, Roman rulers are called Caesars, even in modern times. The guy that was head of Germany was called what? World War I, Kaiser, Caesar. The guy that was the king of Russia, called Tsar, Caesar. Yeah, the eastern and western parts of the Roman Empire. So this name lasts a very, very long time. Anyway, the Antipater, who is the made ruler when the Romans get there. Now, the Romans now are, when Pompey is killed, Judea is kind of in limbo, but Antipater is the head of the Idumeans, or the ruler of the Idumeans. When Antipater, who had supported Caesar in his conquest against Pompey and favored him, and he was made procurator of Judea. Instead of just ruler of the Idumeans, he's now ruler of Judea and Idumea. Now, Idumea in the south, Jerusalem in the central area, Judea in the central area, and Antipater now rules all this area, probably from just north of the Dead Sea all the way south. This is the gift of Julius Caesar. But Antipater doesn't last long. He is poisoned. One of his rivals poisons him, and he dies. But before he dies, he has 4 sons and a daughter. 3 of his sons are 3 of them are not important. But the one that is important, if you notice on the back on the chart, is Herod, who modestly called himself the Great. Probably got that from Alexander. But he was Herod the Great. And these are the Herodians. Now, he was the ruler of Judea when Christ was born, because it's become a Roman province by that time. When Herod was a young man, and we don't know his age, but somewhere between 15 and 25, he was made governor of, kind of a throwaway thing, this area in the north here that was called Galilee. And Galilee at that time was a kind of a no man's land. Think about Oklahoma in the late 1800s, the territories where there was no law and very little order. Well, his father gave it to him and said, you go up there and do what you can. Herod was a very able fella, and anyway, he went up there and really took it over, made peace with the warring crooks and thieves and brigands that were up there, and began to collect taxes for the Romans. The Romans like that. And in 41 BC, then, he was made tetrarch of Judea. And tetrarch means literally ruler of 4 in Roman or Latin. And so he was not one of 4 rulers, he was ruler of one of 4 areas there, which included Judea. Then at some point here, somewhere about this time, is the assassination of Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is killed in March 15th, the Ides of March. And when Julius Caesar is killed, his nephew, whom he had adopted, is made the emperor of Rome. Julius Caesar's nephew was named Gaius Octavius, which means literally number 8. And I don't know, I guess he maybe had 7 brothers and sisters, I don't know, and they'd run out of names, but that's what Octavius means, the 8th one. And when he took over when he became king in 37 BC, he took the name of Augustus, which means August, the respected one, and that's where we get the month August from in our calendar, incidentally. Julius had wanted a month named after him. They had a 10-month calendar, and Julius wanted a month named after him. Didn't want it in winter because it's cold, so he called it July, and Augustus wanted a month named after him too. They called it August. Fortunately, Tiberius stopped the problem, or we'd have 24 or 30 months in a year. But anyway, that's how all that happened in Rome. Anyway, the point, when Augustus was made emperor, he made Herod the king of Judea. Not the tetrarch, but the king of Judea. The first thing Herod did was to kill all the Hasmoneans. Hasmonean or descendant of Mattathias he could find, and appointed his brother-in-law as high priest. Herod the Great was, looking at the history of the man, he was absolutely nuts, insane, crazy, any way you look at crazy. He was extremely paranoid. He thought somebody was trying to kill him, and a lot of people were trying to kill him. He survived over 40 attempts on his life, people trying to kill him because of his excesses. He was you can't imagine how mean the guy was. I told you he made his brother-in-law high priest. Well, later he suspected that his brother-in-law had hatched a plot to kill him. His brother-in-law hadn't, apparently. So he put his brother-in-law and tied a rock to him and threw him in a lake or a pond, and came back and get him a day later, and he said if he was telling the truth, he wouldn't have drowned. Well, he drowned, and he obviously the plot thickened. He killed his wife. He married a lady named Mary Omne, and he killed her. But he apparently really loved her, and he would go out in the desert and talk to her, even though he had her killed. He was not a Jew. He was an Idumean. Again, look at this line here. His grandfather is the first Idumean ruler, and Herod then is the third in line. This is why when the men from the east came into Jerusalem and said, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews?" Herod flew into a panic and had all the baby boys in Bethlehem killed. Born King of the Jews meant that Herod couldn't be King of the Jews. This was a real threat to his problem. He was an Idumean or an Edomite. Now, when he took over, people knew he was an Edomite. And the Orthodox Jews began to seriously resent his rulership. And they formed a resistance party, insisting on a strict adherence, that every Jew strictly adhere to the law of Moses to the letter. And this is where the Pharisees come from. The Pharisees are formed as a resistance to the excesses of Herod. Herod was a usurper to the throne of David. By the time Jesus gets here, the Jews are roughly divided into 5 groups of people: the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, and the Scribes. And you kind of belong to one of those parties. You don't join them, you just kind of practice the things that they say. Anyway, Herod was also a great architect. He built many fortresses and cities. Notice on this map the little yellow dot there. These are the fortresses that Herod the Great built. The last standing of these was the one here called Masada, that's just on the shore of the Dead Sea. This right there, that was one of the fortresses that Herod built. He built these fortresses, and he would go there, and like Masada is on the top of a mountain, a plateau, and it's a long hike, climb up the mountain to get there, and you could go there, Herod could go there and feel safe that no one would attack him. Herod then also began work, knowing that the Jews were opposed to him. He, in 19 BC, he decided to rebuild the temple. The temple had been ruined in 63 when the Romans came in and knocked the walls down and generally fell into disuse. So Herod began to rebuild it. He wanted it to be a structure so large, so magnificent, that the Jews would have to accept him as their king because he had built this magnificent structure. This is the age-old story, folks. How do you get votes? Give people stuff. And when you give people stuff, they vote for you. Who do you support in office? The one that gives me the most stuff. That's exactly what Herod was doing here. He's building a temple. He started it in 19 BC, and it was not finished in the time of Christ. In John chapter 2, verse 20, people looked, Jesus said, the record is Jesus saying that destroy this temple, I'll build it in 3 days. And they said they've been building on this temple 46 years and it's not built yet. And they had indeed. The temple was completed in 64 BC, just 6 years before Jerusalem was destroyed. So that's how long that temple was being built. Why? It didn't take Solomon but 7 years to build the temple. Why did it take Herod the Great 46 years? Because he wanted it bigger and better and grander than anything anybody had ever built. It wasn't, but that was his desire. And it was bigger. If you came into Jerusalem from any direction, the first thing you would have seen would have been the temple. It was a very, very impressive structure. Anyway, Herod the Great died in 4 BC. Herod Antipas, or also called Herod the Tetrarch, took over. This was the Herod who didn't like his wife, so he exiled her to Egypt and married his brother's wife, Herodias, and Herodias being the feminine form of Herod. And his brother was Philip, and this is the one John the Baptist objected to, and this is the one who killed John the Baptist. Then the grandson of Herod the Great was Herod Agrippa. Herod Agrippa is the Herod of the book of Acts. He is the one who killed James with a sword and put Peter in prison when the Lord broke down the boundaries there. You read this in the book of Acts, he had a big celebration after that, wanting to turn the people's thoughts away from the church and to him. And he stood up before the people and proclaimed he was God, and an angel of the Lord smote him, and the Bible says he was eaten of worms and he died. Anyway, this was Herod Agrippa. His son, Herod Agrippa II. Now, at this time, with the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC, the Romans realized that this was getting out of hand. Look, and you can see here this dark shaded area. That's the territory that Herod the Great controlled. After this, the Romans said, no, he's got too much territory. We're not going to let that happen again. We're not going to let one man rule all of this. So they cut this thing up into provinces. They cut the north central section here between the Sea of Galilee and the Mediterranean. That became the province of Galilee. On the east here, this became the province of Perea, also called the Decapolis, because there were 10 cities in it. The middle area here became Samaria, and the southern area became Judah. And at this point, the Romans declared Judea a province of Rome, as opposed to a territory. And the province meant that it was ruled directly by a Roman ruler. And this began not the people, but the Romans. The Romans' port, or place where they came into this, was Caesarea, on the seashore. The Caesarea, Caesar City is, I guess, what you would say, was the port. And this is where the Romans came and went from Israel. But Jerusalem was under the control of Pontius Pilate from 27 BC to 37 AD. And he was called procurator at this, which is something like our governor. Herod Agrippa's son, Herod Agrippa II, ruled this land east of Palestine, this land over here in this area. This is the Agrippa, he dropped the Herod. This is the Agrippa that attended the court of Felix and Festus when Paul was on trial in Caesarea. He had traveled over here, and you remember the story in the book of Acts, how the Roman governor, when Paul started talking about Jewish law, the Roman governor said, we got Agrippa, he's a Jewish expert, we'll let him. He was an Idumean by birth, he wasn't even a Jew, but he had married a Jewish woman, and he said, we'll let him, we'll hear this. And this is where Paul told Agrippa, and Agrippa said, you've almost persuaded me to be a Christian. That was this guy. Herod Agrippa, after the rebellion of 70 AD, it results in the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the Jews. Herod Agrippa comes to Rome, where he later died in Rome. The Romans treated him well. And that's how things got to be how they were when Jesus was born and when Jesus performed his ministry. When Jesus was born, Herod was the king. Herod the Great was king. Incidentally, when Herod the Great died, he died a horrible death. He died liver failure and kidney failure in a time when there was no medicine for that or no treatment for it. He, before he died, just to give you some idea of his madness, he ordered his soldiers, he said, go to every town in my kingdom and pick out 10 men in that town. And when I die, kill those men so that there will be mourning throughout the land, because I know the people won't mourn for me. Now, we don't know that they ever did that was actually carried out, but that was his order. To just pick out 10 innocent people and kill them so that people would be crying in these cities throughout the land when Herod the Great died. You think things are bad now. Things were bad then. Well, this was a guy that was born, and you see his deceit in the scriptures. What did he tell the wise men? We followed the star in the east. We're come to worship him. We go find out where he is, and I'll come worship him too. No, he wanted to kill him, Jesus. He didn't want to worship him. And then, of course, he dies, and then the Herod Agrippa, his grandson, is the Herod of Acts, and the Herod that was there that participated in the trial of Christ. So this is how things got to be how they were. Now, what had God done here? God had opened a window in time. He opened it 63 years before Christ. He closed it 70 years after Christ. During that window, events put Jerusalem at the center of the world stage. That this was where Jerusalem was the trouble spot of the Roman Empire. It was the place nobody wanted to go. It was ungovernable. You couldn't do it. When Pilate, for instance, is just an example. When Pilate became, in 27 BC, when Pilate became procurator of Jerusalem, or Judea, the Roman province of Judea, he came to Caesarea, and he wanted to impress the Jews. So he decided that they would have a parade. He'd go to Jerusalem and have a parade. And in this parade, he carried the banners that the Romans carried. They were very big on that, having banners. And the banners had, of course, it's Rome, they had Caesar's picture on it. When the Jews saw this, they rebelled and revolted because it was an idol. And they learned not to worship idols. And Pilate didn't understand. He didn't understand why would you care? What's the problem? It's just a picture of Caesar. And you're a province of Rome. He didn't get it. He didn't understand the Jews. And this is why he told Jesus, don't you know I could kill you or let you go? What Jesus say? You're here because God put you here. That's the only reason you're here. A more principled man, a more understanding man would have let Jesus go. Think about it. Pilate said, I don't find any fault in this man. He hasn't done anything wrong. Why don't you let him go? He feared the Jews. He was too big a coward to do it. He didn't have the principle or the understanding of the Jews. So he ordered Christ killed. That was a part of God's plan for Jesus to die. Jesus already predicted that. But this is how the political situation got to be what it was when the events of the New Testament take place. Let me remind you in closing. We looked at Old Testament geography from the creation of the world over thousands of years, literally. We get to the New Testament, and we just got about 100 years. And things change, but not that much. Basically, what we're going to look at and next, and we don't have many lessons left, is the changes took place that went from nobody knowing what a church was in 33 AD to everybody knowing what a church was by 100 AD. And even beginning to count time that way, before and after the birth of Christ. So it's a remarkable thing. Even today, and I find this remarkable as I read history books. The atheists and liberals don't want to say BC and AD. because BC stands for before Christ and AD means year of our Lord, Anno Domini. So they say CE, Common Era, and BCE. So if it's BC, it's BCE. You'll read that in books. And if they'll say CE. But when does BCE end and CE start? When Jesus was born. So you beat yourself coming around the back, coming out the back door if you try to stop that. No, the birth of Christ was a seminal incident in the history of this world. Well, thank you for studying with me this evening.